She never once defended herself, not against insults, not against lies. For 7 agonizing days in the courtroom of the Honorable Judge Whittaker, Evelyn Thorne sat in perfect, unbreakable silence, as her husband, the brilliant and beloved tech CEO Marcus Thorne, painted her as a gold-digging, unstable spendthrift to the packed gallery and rolling cameras. She simply stared ahead. She didn't flinch when his lawyer, a shark in a $5,000 suit, paraded doctored financial records. She didn't weep when her own character witnesses, manipulated and bribed, crumbled on the stand. Her own attorney, Mr. Aris, repeatedly begged her to take the stand, to fight the false narrative of a broken marriage crumbling under her neglect. The public, the media, even the judge saw a woman resigned to defeat, a heartbroken wife who had given up. They expected a verdict of crushing loss for her, followed by a wave of public sympathy for the silent, shattered woman. What they got instead was a seismic shock, because the final ruling exposed a meticulous, devastating plan that had been unfolding quietly in the shadows all along. The gavel fell not as an ending, but as a detonation. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. The polished mahogany of the defense table was cool beneath Evelyn Thorne's fingertips. She focused on that single, physical point of contact, the grain of the wood, the slight ridge where 2 panels met, as her husband's baritone voice washed over the courtroom, a practiced symphony of hurt and confusion. I'd come home, Your Honor, after 18-hour days building what I thought was our future, and she'd just be gone, the house empty, no note, sometimes for days. Marcus Thorne paused, letting the weight of his implication settle over the packed gallery. A sympathetic murmur rippled through the spectators. From the corner of her eye, Evelyn saw the jury foreman, a man in his 50s with a kind, weary face, lean forward slightly. He believes him, she thought, not with panic, but with the detached analysis of a scientist observing a predicted reaction. Good. Her own attorney, Ben Aris, shifted uncomfortably in his seat beside her. She could feel the heat of his anxiety, the unspoken plea radiating from him. Object, do something. Let me put you on the stand. She gave a minute, almost imperceptible shake of her head, her eyes never leaving that whorl in the wood grain. Not yet, not ever. And when she'd return, Marcus continued, his voice thickening with what sounded like the ghost of old pain, there was no explanation, just a coldness, a wall. I'd ask about the credit card statements, charges for luxury hotels in Geneva, massive donations to obscure charities, and she'd look right through me. It was like living with a ghost who spent my money. The gallery inhaled sharply. Marcus, the golden boy tech CEO, the philanthropist with the easy smile on magazine covers, was painting a portrait of a hollow, profligate wife. The narrative was clear, elegant in its cruelty. He was the devoted builder, she was the capricious destroyer. Evelyn's silence was the proof. She allowed her gaze to lift just for a second to sweep across the room. The media section was a forest of poised pens and glowing laptop screens. She recognized the headline being written in their eager faces. Silent wife implodes as tech titan testifies. Her mother, sitting in the second row, had a handkerchief clenched in a white-knuckled fist, her eyes red-rimmed. Her father stared stoically ahead, jaw muscle twitching. They saw a daughter broken. They didn't see the blueprint. Her morning had begun not with nervous packing, but with methodical precision. In the stark, rented apartment that was her temporary refuge, she had brewed a single cup of jasmine tea, the scent a deliberate anchor to a calmer self. Seated at a clean desk, she'd opened her tablet, accessing an encrypted file labeled Phoenix. It wasn't a legal document. It was a cascade of data points, timestamps, financial flows charted like constellations, and a timeline that stretched back 3 years. To the first chilling moment, she'd realized the man she loved was a meticulously constructed fiction. Next to a scanned image of a handwritten note Marcus had left her, working late at the incubator again. Don't wait up. She had entered a digital annotation in cool blue text, verifiable via building security logs. He was at the Peninsula Hotel. Room charged to shell company, Etha Holdings. In the courtroom, Marcus's lawyer, the formidable Robert Cray, stood to approach the bench, his shoes clicking a confident rhythm on the marble. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to enter into evidence Exhibit 117, a series of financial records from the joint account, highlighting a pattern of erratic and exorbitant spending by the respondent. Ben Arris stiffened. This is a selective presentation, Your Honor. These transactions are not in context. The context, Mr. Arris, Judge Whitaker interjected, his voice dry as dust, is what we are here to establish. The evidence is admitted. Cray placed a blown-up statement on an easel, swathes of red highlighted lines, $25,000 to the Alpine Conservation Initiative, $12,000 at La Réserve Genève, $50,000 to the Oceanic Preservation League. The jury looked at the numbers, then at Evelyn, the silent woman in the simple charcoal gray suit. The math of guilt seemed irrefutable. Evelyn's mind, however, replayed the memory attached to the Geneva charge. Marcus, holding her face in his hands, his eyes bright with ersatz passion. Darling, the tax implications are phenomenal. We make the donation, the charity is a pass-through, the capital gets parked offshore. It's how the game is played. Just use this card, for us. She had been the reluctant conduit, her financial footprint weaponized against her. She had copies of every email, every text where he directed the transactions, buried deep within Phoenix. But today was not the day for defense. Today was the day for exhibition. Let him showcase his forged reality. Your Honor, Cray said, turning to the jury with a theatrical sigh. What we see here is not the spending of a partner in a marriage, but the unchecked withdrawals of a solitary individual with no regard for the labor that funded it. This is the financial portrait of a broken vow. The words broken vow hung in the air, the official label for their tragedy, the niche the public craved. The story of love turned to dust. They had no idea they were watching a forensic audit disguised as a soap opera. During recess in the sterile, fluorescent-lit consultation room, Ben finally broke. He slammed a file folder down. Evelyn, you have to let me fight back. He's telling the court you were emotionally absent, financially irresponsible. I have witnesses who can speak to your character, to your work on the early prototypes of Thorne Dynamics. We can show them who you really are. Evelyn turned from the window where she'd been watching pigeons battle for a crust of bread on the courthouse steps. Who I really am is irrelevant, Ben. It's a subjective debate. He's a master of subjectivity. He'll spin, he'll charm, he'll cry. My truth against his truth is a swamp. I will not step into it. Then what is this? Ben gestured wildly at the closed door, beyond which the circus of the trial awaited. You're just letting him win the narrative. The narrative, Evelyn said, her voice low and utterly steady, is his to win. Let him own every word of it. Let him swear under oath that he was the diligent husband, that I was the phantom spendthrift. Our job is to enter into evidence the documents, the bank transfers he signed, the corporate filings from the Caymans, the server logs that show him accessing the charity portals from his laptop, not to argue about them, just to enter them, cleanly, dryly, without commentary. Ben stared at her, a dawning, horrified understanding replacing his frustration. You're not trying to out-argue him, you're trying to perjury trap him. Evelyn said nothing. She simply reopened her briefcase, extracted a fresh legal pad, and wrote a single line in precise handwriting, sliding it to Ben. The law can ignore a sob story. It cannot ignore a provable fraud. My silence is the vacuum. His ego will fill it with lies. The evidence will be the seal. The afternoon session was worse. Cray called their former marital therapist, a Dr. Albright with gentle eyes and a soothing voice, who testified under gentle prompting about Evelyn's reluctance to engage in emotional intimacy, her guarded and sometimes flat affect, which she had diagnosed as a possible dissociative response, potentially rooted in attachment trauma. It was psychological jargon that painted Evelyn as broken, unfixable. The coup de grace came when Cray asked, "Based on your sessions, Dr. Albright, would you say Mrs. Thorne's behavior was consistent with a person capable of upholding the mutual commitments of a marriage?" Ben objected. calls for a conclusion, Your Honor, and goes beyond the scope. Overruled. The witness is an expert in marital dynamics. You may answer. Dr. Albright looked painfully at Evelyn. In my professional opinion, no. She was walled off. The marriage for her seemed to be an arrangement that had outlived its emotional purpose. Another perfect brick in Marcus's wall. Evelyn knew because Phoenix contained the wire transfer receipt from Marcus to a private account under Dr. Albright's sister's name, dated 2 weeks before the first therapy session. The diagnosis had been purchased, but to reveal that now would be to play the accuser, to get into a messy, he said she said about corruption. It would detract from the clean, cold, mathematical case she was assembling. So she sat, and she absorbed it. The final blow of the day was Marcus returning to the stand for redirect. Cray, oozing false compassion, asked, Marcus, after all of this, the absences, the spending, the emotional distance, why are you even here? What are you hopping for from this court? Marcus turned his body fully toward Judge Whittaker, his performance raw and beseeching. I loved her, Your Honor. I loved the woman she was. I'm here because the woman she is now, that woman is a stranger living in my house, spending the wealth I built for our family. I'm just hopping for fairness, for a chance to rebuild what's left of my life without the anchor of this broken bond. He let his gaze fall on Evelyn, a look of profound public sorrow. I just want to be free. It was masterful. The gallery was moist-eyed. A journalist in the front row dabbed at her own cheek. The jury looked moved. Judge Whittaker's stern expression seemed to soften a fraction. As the court adjourned, the roar of conversation erupted. Cameras swiveled to capture Evelyn's exit. Would she break down? Would she finally speak? She stood, smoothed her suit jacket, and collected her pad and pen. She felt the weight of 100 stares, pitying, contemptuous, curious. She walked past Marcus, who was receiving a supportive pat on the back from Cray. He didn't look at her. He was already basking in the victory of the day's narrative. In the back of the town car, Ben was silent, seething with a sense of professional and personal defeat. Evelyn stared out at the city blurring past. Her phone vibrated with a secure notification. It was from Clara, the retired forensic accountant who was her secret weapon, her co-architect of Phoenix. Phase 1 complete, the message read. Narrative lock achieved. His testimony, Ray. Geneva charges and joint account directly contradicts evidence logs 228B and 455C. The perjury is now on the record. The trap is set. Evelyn allowed herself a single, slow exhalation. She typed a one-word reply. Proceed. She looked at Ben's ashen profile. He thought they were losing. He thought her silence was a surrender. He didn't understand that in a war fought with words, the most powerful move was sometimes to offer none. To let the enemy's own voice, confident and unchecked, fill the chamber until it echoed with nothing but his own lies. The verdict would be the gavel that turned that echo into a deafening verdict of his own making. Phase 1 was indeed complete. The stage was his. The story was his. Now, they would wait for the law to read the footnotes. The air in the courtroom on the day of the verdict was thick enough to bottle. It smelled of old wood, anxious perfume, and the faint, metallic tang of anticipation. Every seat was a tight knot of tension, the gallery a mosaic of leaned-forward bodies and sharp, watching eyes. The media row was a silent hive, fingers poised over keyboards, camera lenses focused like predatory eyes on the two figures at the opposing tables. Evelyn Thorne sat with the same poised stillness she'd maintained for 7 days. Her hands were folded on the same patch of cool mahogany. She wore a simple navy blue dress, a color of depth and resolve, not the morning gray of previous days. She was not a specter today. She was an anchor. Beside her, Ben Arris fidgeted with a pen, his knuckles white. He had slept little, haunted by the specter of professional failure, of watching a client be professionally and publicly dismantled without raising a hand in her own defense. Across the aisle, Marcus Thorne was a study in contained triumph. He wore a suit of charcoal so fine it seemed to absorb the light, a tasteful burgundy tie a splash of confident power. He exchanged a quiet, solemn word with Robert Cray, whose smile was a thin, satisfied slice on his face. Marcus's posture was that of a man ready to receive a burdensome but just reward. He glanced once briefly toward Evelyn, a look not of malice but of poignant regret, perfectly calibrated for any camera that caught it. The final chapter of the tragedy, the look said. So sad but necessary. Judge Whittaker entered, his black robes whispering of finality. The room snapped to a hushed, rigid attention. The ritual of all rise was performed, and they settled again into the creaking pews. The judge's face was an unreadable monument, his eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the document before him. "This has been a most unusual proceeding," Judge Whittaker began, his dry voice cutting through the silence. "The court has heard extensive testimony concerning the breakdown of the marital bond between Marcus and Evelyn Thorne. Much of that testimony, particularly from petitioner Mr. Thorne, has been compelling in its depiction of emotional estrangement and financial profligacy." He paused, letting the words hang. Marcus inclined his head slightly, a gracious acceptance of the court's understanding. Cray made a note on his legal pad. Evelyn did not breathe. She was a statue. "The respondent, Mrs. Thorne," the judge continued, his gaze lifting to settle on her, "elected throughout to exercise her right to silence. While certainly her prerogative, this choice has, understandably, made it challenging to ascertain her perspective or to counter the narrative presented." Ben closed his eyes for a second. Here it comes, he thought, the rebuke, the rationale for the loss. "However," Judge Whittaker said, and the word was a cleaver falling, severing the anticipated sentence. He adjusted his glasses. "This court's primary duty is not to adjudicate the theater of marital discord, nor to award victory to the more persuasive performer. Its duty is to adjudicate fact. And in this case, the factual evidence submitted into the record by the respondent's counsel, though offered without a single word of explanatory testimony, is, in a word, incontrovertible." A tiny, almost imperceptible ripple went through the room. Marcus's serene expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered to Cray. Cray's pen stopped moving. "I will address the key findings," the judge stated, his tone shifting from summative to analytical, the tone of a surgeon listing observations. "First, the pattern of spending from the joint accounts, which the petitioner characterized as erratic and solitary dissipation by the respondent." He lifted a sheet. "Exhibits R102 through R115, bank records and wire transfer confirmations, demonstrate that while the expenditures were indeed made from accounts in Mrs. Thorne's name, the initiating instructions for each major transaction, including the $25,000 to Alpine Conservation and the $50,000 to Oceanic Preservation, originated from a dedicated encrypted email server. Digital forensic analysis, entered as Exhibit R401, confirms this server was accessed exclusively from devices owned and operated by Mr. Thorne, including on dates and times when he testified under oath to being in business meetings or at corporate headquarters." The air began to change. The pity in the room curdled, shifting into something like confusion. A reporter in the front row stopped typing, her head tilting. Marcus's jaw tightened. A faint line appeared between his brows. "Second," Judge Whittaker intoned, "the petitioner's reliance on the prenuptial agreement executed in 2015. He looked over his glasses at Marcus. This agreement was predicated on a full and fair disclosure of assets. Exhibit R500 is a notarized financial statement from Mr. Thorne dated 1 week prior to the signing, listing his total net worth at $4.2 million, primarily tied to a fledgling software venture. Exhibit R501, however, is a shareholder agreement for that same venture, signed 3 months asterisk prior to the prenup, showing an unregistered third-party investment of $8 million from a private equity firm. This investment was not disclosed. Furthermore, Exhibit R502 shows that the holding vehicle for that investment, Etha Ventures, is solely owned by a trust whose only beneficiary is Mr. Thorne. This constitutes a fraudulent inducement to contract. The prenuptial agreement, is therefore rendered null and void. A gasp, sharp and collective, escaped the gallery. Marcus's face lost its composed hue, draining to a sickly pale. Cray was now frantically flipping through a binder, his earlier confidence gone. Ben Arris sat up straight, his mouth slightly agape, looking from the judge to Evelyn, who hadn't moved a muscle. Third, the judge's voice grew harder, colder. The petitioner's assertion of a single, marital economic unit built by his labor. The evidence tells a different story. Exhibits R600 through R620 trace a systematic, 5-year diversion of funds from Thorne Dynamics, operating accounts into a series of layered shell companies, culminating in holdings in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. These diversions, totaling in excess of $22 million, were characterized in internal bookkeeping as consulting fees and intellectual property licensing, but no corresponding consulting agreements or IP transfer documents exist. Under state law, this constitutes intentional dissipation of marital assets. It is not merely hiding wealth, it is the theft of community property. The gavel of fact was falling, blow after devastating blow. The narrative of the heartbroken builder shattered under the weight of forensic accounting. The courtroom was no longer a theater for a tragic play. It was a laboratory, and the specimen under the microscope was Marcus Thorne's testimony. And it was dissecting itself. "Your Honor, I must object," Cray finally burst out, rising to his feet. This is a one-sided presentation of complex financial data that was never properly contextualized. We were not given a chance to rebut. "You were given every chance, Counselor," Judge Whittaker interrupted, his voice icy. "You spent 7 days contextualizing. Your client spent hours on the stand contextualizing. Mrs. Thorne submitted the data. You chose not to call your own financial experts to rebut it, presumably because you were so focused on the emotional context. The data stands. And it contradicts, in specific and material ways, the sworn testimony of your client regarding his financial transparency and the origin of the disputed expenditures." The word perjury was not spoken. It didn't need to be. It vibrated in the air, thick and toxic. Judge Whittaker took a final breath, his eyes sweeping the silent, stunned room. Therefore, on the grounds of fraudulent inducement, intentional dissipation of assets, and the totality of the factual record which wholly undermines the petitioner's credibility, the court rules as follows. He listed the judgments. They fell like stones into a still pond, each creating widening ripples of shock. Awarding 65% of the total marital estate to the respondent, Evelyn Thorne, including the immediate freezing and repatriation of all offshore holdings identified in Exhibits R600 through R620. Marcus was shaking his head, a tiny, frantic motion of denial. Granting sole title and operating control of the entity Thorne Dynamics to the respondent, based on her provable foundational role in its creation, and the petitioner's demonstrable breach of fiduciary duty. A strangled sound escaped Marcus's throat. And awarding punitive damages in the amount of $5 million to the respondent, due to the petitioner's bad faith conduct and malicious litigation strategy designed to obscure the truth and exploit the judicial process. The gavel fell crack. The sound was a gunshot marking the end of the old world. For a second, there was pure, vacuum silence. Then chaos erupted. The gallery exploded in a roar of voices. Camera flashes popped like frantic lightning, illuminating Marcus's face, now a mask of sheer, unvarnished horror. He shoved his chair back, it screeched against the floor. "This is an outrage," he shouted, his voice raw, stripping away all the polished charisma. "She set this up. This is a trap." Cray was grabbing his arm, hissing urgently, trying to contain the disaster, but Marcus was a bull seeing red. He whirled toward Evelyn, his finger jabbing across the aisle. You did this. You sat there like a stone and you calculated this." Evelyn, for the first time in the entire trial, moved. Slowly, deliberately, she stood. She did not look at the screaming man who was her husband. She looked at Ben Arris, whose face was a canvas of dawning, awestruck realization. The frantic noise of the room seemed to bend around her quiet epicenter. She leaned toward Ben, her voice so low only he could hear it above the din, each word measured and clear. The law can ignore a sob story, Ben. It can't ignore a provable fraud. My silence was the vacuum. His ego filled it with lies. All we did was hold up the mirror. Ben stared at her, finally seeing the architect where he had seen only a statue. He saw the 3 years of meticulous evidence gathering, the choice to endure the public shamming without a word, the brilliant, brutal strategy of allowing Marcus to build his own gallows with every exaggerated tear, every crafted anecdote, every sworn denial that the documents would now contradict. It wasn't a defense. It was a prosecution. Across the aisle, Marcus was being physically urged toward a side door by his team, his shouts devolving into incoherent rage, the final, devastating image for the cameras. Not the wronged titan, but a cornered fraud, his true self unmasked by the very judgment he had sought. Evelyn turned and walked, not toward the scrum at the main doors, but toward a quiet side exit held open by a bailiff. She did not smile. She did not weep. She simply moved forward, leaving the cacophony of her former life behind. The verdict was not an end. It was a key turning in a long-locked door, and on the other side was not just money or a company. It was the silent, powerful truth, finally speaking in a voice that could not be ignored. The side door of the courtroom clicked shut behind Evelyn, a soft, final sound that severed the chaos like a guillotine. In the sterile, empty hallway, the roar of the gallery was reduced to a muffled, distant storm. She leaned against the cool cinderblock wall for a single, solitary moment, eyes closed and simply breathed. It wasn't the breath of relief, but of a deep-sea diver who has finally broken the surface after a long, perilous ascent through crushing darkness. The pressure was gone. The silence was now her own. Ben Arris burst through the door a moment later, his face a torrent of emotions, triumph, disbelief, a kind of giddy vertigo. "Evelyn, my God, I've never in 22 years of practice." He shook his head, words failing him. He wasn't just a lawyer who had won. He was an engineer who had just witnessed a hidden, elegant mechanism spring to perfect, devastating life. You knew, the whole time, you knew he would perjure himself on specifics if he felt unchallenged. "He needed a villain, Ben," Evelyn said, pushing off the wall, her voice steady but alive now with a quiet energy that had been suppressed for years. "A vague villain isn't compelling. He needed specifics, Geneva, the charities, my coldness. He needed to embody the wronged party completely. To do that, he had to commit to details, and details under oath are flammable when held against a paper trail." She began walking down the corridor, her heels tapping a purposeful rhythm. "Let the media have the meltdown footage. That's the punctuation on the sentence we just wrote." The world outside was a different kind of storm. Her phone, silenced for the trial, now buzzed and blinked like a frenzied creature, dozens of voicemails, hundreds of texts and emails. The narrative had flipped in the time it took to walk down a hallway. The headline was "Silent Wife Implodes." It was silent strategist's courtroom checkmate and Thorne's tears exposed as fraud. She ignored the cacophony for now. There was one call she had to make. In the back of the town car, windows tinted against the prying lenses of photographers who had given up on the snarling, blocked exit where Marcus was presumably trapped, she dialed a number from memory. It was answered on the first ring. The seal held. The voice on the other end was Clara's, crisp and devoid of superfluous emotion. It was the voice of a fellow architect. "It did," Evelyn said, a real smile touching her lips for the first time in months. "The judgment references the offshore holdings by their exhibit numbers. The repatriation order is in." "Good, I'll initiate the contact with the compliance officers in Luxembourg. They're already prepared. The funds will be moving by week's end." There was a pause, a rare hint of warmth. It was a masterclass in patient leverage, Evelyn. "It was a team effort, Clara. Phase 3 begins now." She ended the call and finally looked at Ben, who was watching her as if seeing a new person. "What," he asked slowly, "is Phase 3? "Ownership," she said simply. Ownership began not with a celebration but with a takeover. 2 days after the verdict, Evelyn walked into the sleek glass and steel headquarters of Thorne Dynamics. She did not slink in. She arrived at 8:15 a.m. carrying a leather folio, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit of deep emerald green. The lobby, usually buzzing with the casual energy of a successful tech firm, fell into a stunned, watchful hush. Employees froze mid-stride, coffee cups halted halfway to lips. They had seen the news. They had watched their charismatic founder unravel on live-streamed camera. Now they saw the silent wife, the supposed phantom, made manifest and radiating an unnerving, calm authority. She went straight to the CEO's suite. Her suite, according to the court order, already served to the board. Marcus's personal assistant, a young man named Leo who had always treated Evelyn with polite dismissal on her rare visits, looked up, pale and panicked. "Mrs. Thorne, Mr. Thorne's access has been revoked, but I wasn't told." "It's Ms. Thorne, Leo," she said, her tone not unkind but allowing zero ambiguity. "And I'm telling you now. Please schedule an all-hands meeting for 10 a.m. in the main atrium, and have it ensure my access is fully operational to all servers, including the R&D archives from 2012 onward." By 9:55, the atrium was packed, a sea of anxious, curious faces. Whispers slithered through the crowd. What does she know about tech? She's just the money now. Is she here to liquidate? At precisely 10, Evelyn walked onto the modest stage, no podium, just a wireless microphone. She didn't wait for silence, her presence commanded it. "Good morning. For those who don't know me, my name is Evelyn Thorne. Many of you have seen a certain version of me in the media over the past weeks." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, connecting with individual eyes. "That version was a fiction. Today I'd like to show you a few facts." She nodded to Leo, who dimmed the lights. A screen behind her lit up. The first image was a faded digital photograph, a messy garage. 2 young people sat on the concrete floor, surrounded by soldering irons and circuit boards. A younger, softer-faced Evelyn, her hair in a ponytail, was pointing at a line of code on a laptop screen. Next to her, a younger Marcus grinned at the camera, his arm around her shoulders. A caption read, "Prototype V3 solved the latency issue. Ease algorithm." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of the old-timers, engineers who had been with the company since the garage days, nodded slowly, memories stirring. The next image was a scan of a patent filing. The title, Dynamic Data Stream Optimization Protocol. The listed inventors, Evelyn Thorne, Marcus Thorne. "This," Evelyn said, her voice clear and firm, "is the foundational patent for what became the Synapse Network Engine, the core product that built this company. My algorithm, our work." She advanced the slide. Now it showed early business plans, her handwriting in the margins next to Marcus, debating market approaches. "I was not a phantom. I was the co-founder. Then I was systematically erased from the story." She clicked again. The screen now showed a simple, elegant logo, a stylized phoenix rising. Beneath it, the Phoenix Fund. "The past is prologue. I am not here to seek revenge or to loot this company. I am here to lead it. And to use a portion of the resources the court has rightly returned to correct a wrong that extends far beyond these walls." She explained concisely. A dedicated fund to provide forensic accounting and legal representation for individuals, spouses, business partners, trapped in relationships where financial control and hidden assets were weapons. "Because the silence of a victim," she said, her voice dropping, yet somehow filling the room, "should never be mistaken for consent. It is often just the quiet before the truth finds its voice." When she finished, there was no wild applause. There was something better, a deep, resonant silence of understanding, followed by a steady, building wave of nods and scattered, genuine claps that grew into solid, respectful approval. She hadn't won them with charisma. She had won them with truth, competence, and a purpose larger than herself. The final confrontation was inevitable. It came a week later at dusk. Evelyn was working in her new office, reviewing the R&D pipeline when her intercom buzzed. Leo's voice was tense. "Ms. Thorne, Mr. Thorne is here. He's insistent. Security is with him." "Let him in, Leo. Then you can go home." Marcus looked like a ghost of his former self. His expensive suit was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot and burning with a desperate fury. The door closed, leaving them alone in the spacious office, the city lights beginning to sparkle beyond the glass. "You bitch," he hissed, the words stripped of all pretense. "You scheming, cold-hearted bitch. You played the long game, didn't you? All that silence, just waiting to gut me." Evelyn remained seated, steepling her fingers. "I documented the truth, Marcus. You gutted yourself. Every transfer, every shell company, every lie to the therapist you paid for. I just collected the evidence. You provided the performance." "This was my company," he roared, slamming a fist on her desk. "Our company," she corrected, her voice ice. "Built on my work. You were just the better salesman until you started selling a fiction to the court." He leaned forward, his face contorted, trying to find the old leverage, the emotional pressure point. "We had something real once, Evie, before all this. You remember, I loved you." It was the last, desperate gambit of the manipulator, trying to rewrite history once more. Evelyn looked at him, and for the first time he saw not anger, not hurt, but a profound, clean emptiness. There was no hook left in her for him to pull. "The man I loved was a character you played, Marcus. A brilliant, charming character, but the performance is over." She stood, not in aggression, but in finality. "The audience is gone. The reviews are in. There's nothing left for you here." She pressed a button on her desk. "Security will see you out." He stared, deflating, the rage giving way to a hollow, terrifying realization. He had lost. Not just the money, the company, but the narrative itself. The story was now hers. He was just the disgraced footnote. He left without another word, a broken marionette with his strings cut. Later that night, the office was quiet. The digital frames on the wall, which had once shown generic art, now cycled through images. The garage, the first patent, the new Phoenix Fund logo. Evelyn sat back, a single glass of water in her hand. On her tablet, a single email was open. A heartfelt thank you from a woman in another state who had seen the news and, inspired, found the courage to subpoena her own husband's hidden business records. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the window, her reflection superimposed on the glittering skyline. The silent woman in the glass was gone. In her place was someone steely, assured, and quietly powerful. The battle was won, but the war, the larger war against the tyranny of hidden truths, was just beginning. And she was no longer a prisoner in that war. She was a general. She took a sip of water, the coolness a crisp, present sensation. Silence in the right hands is not a void, she thought, the words clear in her mind. It's a chamber, a resonant chamber that amplifies the truth when it finally rings out. She looked away from her reflection, directly forward as if seeing beyond the walls, to the audience who had witnessed her journey. A faint, unbreakable smile touched her lips. "And my voice," she whispered to the empty, powerful room, "is just getting started.